Men and women, I want you to understand this with the seriousness of eternity upon your soul. Problems do not disappear because time passes. They disappear when consciousness changes. The world is full of people trying to pray problems away while holding them tightly in their minds, rehearsing them, confessing them, magnifying them, and then wondering why they remain. I tell you plainly, what fills your consciousness governs your experience. God never intended his people to live problem-conscious. He intended them to live God-conscious truth, conscious authority, conscious. When the soul awakens to divine consciousness, problems do not slowly weaken, they collapse, they lose their voice, they fade as shadows before the rising sun. You see, every problem feeds on attention. It grows fat on fear, it strengthens itself on anxiety, it survives on constant remembrance. The moment a man rises above that level and refuses to bow his thoughts to circumstances, something mighty happens within him. Faith does not wrestle with problems, faith outgrows them. Faith does not negotiate with difficulty. It stands in a higher realm where difficulty has no language. When your consciousness is filled with the living truth of God, problems cannot maintain form, for they are sustained only in the atmosphere of doubt and divided thought. I have seen people cry until their strength was gone, not because the problem was strong, but because their consciousness was small. They lived beneath the privilege of divine awareness. But when the Spirit of God awakens a person to who they are in Him, that same problem that once terrorized them becomes strangely powerless. Nothing changed outwardly at first, but everything changed inwardly, and inward change always governs outward results. God never starts with the mountain, He starts with the man who sees the mountain differently. Consciousness is the doorway of power. What you habitually think, believe, and accept becomes the law of your life. If your consciousness is filled with lack, lack will follow you like a shadow. If your consciousness is filled with fear, fear will answer every knock at your door. But when your consciousness is filled with God's sufficiency, God's authority, God's dominion, problems find no resting place. They search for agreement and find none. They look for fear and find faith standing guard. Many want deliverance without transformation, relief without renewal, answers without awakening. But God does not remove problems to protect your old consciousness. He elevates your consciousness so problems can no longer rule you. The Spirit lifts you into a realm where you see from heaven's side instead of earth's side. From there, problems appear small, temporary, and already defeated. You stop asking when they will leave because you realize they have already lost the right to stay. There is a consciousness that speaks weakness and a consciousness that speaks authority. One says, "This is too much for me," and the other says, "This has no power over me." One bows, the other commands. God never anointed weakness, He anointed authority. When your consciousness aligns with divine authority, you do not beg life to change, you speak and life responds. Problems disappear not because you shout louder, but because you stand clearer in truth. The trouble with many believers is not the size of their problem, but the confusion of their inner vision. They look at God through the problem instead of looking at the problem through God. Consciousness determines perspective, and perspective determines outcome. When your consciousness is saturated with God's nature, you no longer ask if He is able, you know He is present, and where God is consciously acknowledged, disorder cannot remain. I tell you this as a spiritual law. What you refuse to carry in consciousness cannot continue in manifestation. When you stop rehearsing defeat, when you stop entertaining fear, when you stop agreeing with limitation, the problem loses its energy source. It starves, it weakens, it fades. Faith is not effort, it is alignment. It is the soul resting in divine reality while circumstances struggle to survive outside of it. There is a place in God where problems cannot shout loud enough to be heard. That place is not reached by striving, but by surrendering your inner world to truth. When your consciousness is yielded to God, peace becomes dominant, confidence becomes natural, and authority becomes effortless. You do not fight for victory, you function from it. Problems disappear because they cannot exist where dominion is understood. Many times people say, I am waiting for God to change this. But God is waiting for them to see differently. The moment your consciousness changes, your language changes, your prayers change, your posture changes, and soon enough, your situation changes. Heaven always moves in agreement with faith-filled consciousness. God does not respond to panic. He responds to alignment. I want you to know that divine consciousness is not imagination. It is revelation. It is seeing what God has already declared to be true and living as though it governs every detail of your life. When that happens, problems do not need to be chased away. They leave on their own, embarrassed by the presence of truth. Darkness never needs to be pushed. It vanishes when light is recognized. So lift your consciousness above complaint, above fear, above self-pity. Refuse to meditate on what opposes you. Meditate on what empowers you. Let your inner world be so filled with divine reality that problems find no agreement, no shelter, no voice. This is not denial, this is dominion. This is not ignoring reality, this is choosing the higher reality. And as your consciousness remains anchored there, you will find that what once troubled you now struggles to even exist in your presence. For problems cannot survive where God, consciousness, reigns uninterrupted. You must understand that consciousness is not something you visit on occasion. It is something you inhabit continually. Whatever realm you live in inwardly becomes the realm that governs you outwardly. Many people step into faith for a moment and then return to fear as their permanent residence. That divided consciousness creates instability, and instability gives problems permission to linger. God never designed you to live in two realms at once. When the inner man is established in divine awareness, the outer world is forced to follow. I have watched people receive a momentary lift in a meeting, only to descend again because they never guarded their consciousness afterward. They allowed old thoughts to re-enter, old fears to speak again, old confessions to reclaim authority. Consciousness must be guarded with holy jealousy. What you allow to speak within you will eventually speak through you, and what speaks through you will shape your future. Problems do not return because they are strong. They return because the door of consciousness was reopened. The Spirit of God never works in confusion. When He fills the mind, clarity comes. When clarity comes, hesitation leaves. When hesitation leaves, authority manifests. This is why a person who truly knows where they stand in God does not argue with circumstances. They do not plead their case to life. They stand still inwardly, and life adjusts outwardly. Consciousness rooted in God produces a stillness that terrifies disorder. Many people mistake noise for power. They shout at problems while silently agreeing with them inside. But agreement is not made with the mouth alone. It is made with the mind and heart united. When your consciousness agrees with God, even whispered faith carries more weight than loud unbelief. Heaven listens for alignment, not volume. Problems listen for fear, not words. There is a realm where faith becomes natural rather than forced. In that realm, you do not work yourself into belief. Belief works itself out of you. Your reactions change before your circumstances do. You respond with peace where you once responded with panic. You respond with confidence where you once responded with despair. That change is the signal that consciousness has shifted, and once it shifts, problems begin to lose ground rapidly. I want you to see that consciousness determines what you permit. Whatever you tolerate mentally, you authorize spiritually. If you tolerate fear, it will organize your life. If you tolerate doubt, it will dictate your decisions. But when you refuse to tolerate anything that contradicts God's truth, you establish a boundary that problems cannot cross. They may knock, but they cannot enter. They may shout, but they cannot stay. Faith-filled consciousness does not deny the existence of problems. It denies them dominion. It acknowledges that something has tried to rise, but refuses to bow to it. That refusal is not stubbornness. It is spiritual intelligence. It is knowing that God has already spoken a higher word, and that word governs all others. When consciousness is trained to recognize the highest authority, lower voices lose their power automatically. Many live as though God must be persuaded to act, but God is always ready. It is consciousness that must be persuaded to agree. The moment agreement is reached, resistance begins to crumble. Heaven and earth respond to alignment. When the inner man aligns with divine truth, the outer world has no choice but to realign. This is not mysticism, it is the order of spiritual law. I have seen situations change suddenly, not because prayer lasted longer, but because consciousness finally settled. Rest is a sign of faith. Anxiety is a sign of divided vision. When consciousness rests in God, the soul stops striving, and striving is often what keeps problems alive. Problems thrive in agitation but suffocate in peace. Peace is not passivity, it is confidence anchored in truth. There is a strength that comes when consciousness is purified of fear. It is not emotional strength, it is spiritual weight. That weight is felt in the unseen realm. Problems sense it. Disorder recognizes it. Resistance weakens under it. You do not need to announce authority when you carry it inwardly. Authority carried in consciousness expresses itself without effort. People often ask why some believers seem to move through life untouched by chaos, while others struggle constantly. The difference is not favoritism, it is consciousness. One lives aware of God's nearness, the other lives aware of problems' presence. Awareness determines influence. What you are most aware of will have the greatest influence over you. When God becomes your dominant awareness, everything else becomes secondary. This is why meditation on truth is essential. Not casual thinking, not occasional reflection, but deliberate dwelling. What you dwell on builds structure in the soul. That structure either supports fear or supports faith. A consciousness built on divine truth becomes immovable. Problems may strike it, but they cannot shake it. They exhaust themselves trying to move what refuses to bend. You were never meant to be a container for worry. Worry is a misuse of imagination. It is imagination trained in the wrong direction. Faith is imagination aligned with truth. When consciousness imagines from God's viewpoint, problems shrink to their proper size. They no longer appear eternal. They appear temporary. They no longer appear powerful. They appear limited. I want you to see that divine consciousness produces expectation, and expectation attracts manifestation. What you expect inwardly prepares the way outwardly. If you expect struggle, you prepare room for it. If you expect victory, you prepare room for it. Expectation is not wishful thinking, it is consciousness anticipating alignment, and when alignment comes, manifestation follows naturally. There is a holy discipline in refusing to entertain thoughts that contradict God. This discipline is not repression, it is selection. You choose what you allow to shape you. You choose which voice you honor. When you consistently choose truth, consciousness becomes stable, and stability produces authority. Authority exercised consistently makes problems uncomfortable until they finally depart. Problems disappear not because they are chased, but because they are replaced. When consciousness is filled, there is no vacancy. Darkness flees when light occupies fully. Fear leaves when faith takes residence. Confusion retreats when truth stands firm. You do not need to fight what has no place to stand, and so the work is inward before it is outward. Guard the inner world, cultivate divine awareness, refuse to let your thoughts wander into agreement with defeat. Let your consciousness remain fixed on what God has already declared. As that consciousness becomes your constant habitation, you will notice something remarkable. Situations that once demanded all your attention will begin resolving themselves. Obstacles will weaken without explanation, and what once seemed immovable will quietly lose its grip. For problems cannot survive in a soul that has learned to live consciously in the higher realm, where truth governs without interruption.